Yeah, so who's using the framework is very closely tied, but not limited by who helped us build the framework. We spent an 18-month process talking to private industry, civil society, academia, government agencies. So it is not just in the US federal government. In fact, so we know that there's uptake and adoption of the framework in private industry. Microsoft is one. We have, like Ilham said, statements on our website of others who have taken it up, and we will be sharing. They will be sharing some of their use cases more broadly. Certainly, there's discussion about whether it will, how and where and when it will be used and adopted within the federal government. But we also see at the state level connection to regulation being written, that they have been influenced by the AI risk management framework.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up, and it's reassuring that kind of a spectrum of voices helped create and develop these guidelines, and that it's not just used by one particular government entity. Um, how how do you see this evolving over the? I mean, like a lot of people like to talk about the kind of abstract future of AI and some terrifying potential, but in the reality, maybe we could look at the next like 6, 12, 18 months. How do you see this evolving, or how do you see industry and governments evolving around this as policy is developed and unfolds?
Well, the framework was designed to purposefully be general, so that it can be adopted and adapted to specific contexts. So, so that future will look like where it's adopted. So, you know, in the financial industry and healthcare and hiring, that's what it's going to look like. But some of that is work that we refer to in our parlance as AI RMF profiles. That's an example or an instance of the framework for that specific context. And while it can exist within industry verticals, there's also this kind of things that happen across these sectors, including large language models, generative AI writ large. How can organizations use a version of the framework to manage those risks, or in the cloud, for manufacturing, for customer support?
Yeah, that's for those watching, and I mean, there's probably a lot of people in the audience who are like normal people and not really in the B2B tech world. But for those who are in industry or government and might be policymakers and might have to adopt these, where this isn't a like, where can I go to learn more? But what best practices do you advise on those who might be developing policies? Where should they go? What should they learn? How do they get started with their not just themselves, but their organizations?
Yeah. And so your point that you said, like, where do people go to get started? And that's the kind of point, is that people don't need to wait for anything to get started with the framework. They can get started today. They can find the framework online in its own PDF format, but it's also, all of our content's available on our resource center website, which is airc.nist.gov. That includes, like Ilham mentioned, our glossary, but we also have our playbook. And the playbook is not it's not a checklist, and it's not meant to be followed exhaustively or step by step. Entities can, whether they're private industry, whether they're a federal agency or a state agency, a civil society, or wherever they are, they can go through that list and identify what things are most related to their context and start implementing them. First and foremost is governance. Governance is one of the 4 functions in the framework, and that is where we suggest everyone get started if they don't already have an existing governance function, and if they do, how do they adapt their existing governance functions for AI risks?